Guy Edward Swanson, known to everybody close to him simply as Ed, was born in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1922. When the Second World War broke out, he was enrolled at the University of Pittsburgh and remained there as a student, graduating with both BA and MA degrees in 1943. He went on to complete his PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago in 1948 and then embarked on his academic career. After short stays at Boston and Indiana universities, he moved to the University of Michigan, where he spent nearly 2 decades and where he published the 1960 book, Birth of the Gods, from which this reading is excerpted. By the end of that decade, in 1969, he moved again to the University of California at Berkeley, first in the sociology department until 1984, and then in the psychology department for another 7 years until he retired, facing a struggle with cancer, which claimed his life in 1995. Birth of the Gods presents Swanson's first major contribution to the sociology of religion, applying Durkheim's ideas of the parallel between people's beliefs and the structure of their social institutions. Swanson's creative new hypotheses, deduced from Durkheim's perspective, and his innovative use of the Ethnographic Atlas as a data source provided lively new insights into this quintessentially sociological research area. When we think about religions as organized institutions in societies, we can still be interested in personal religious beliefs and experiences. Instead of concentrating only on describing people's beliefs, though, we find ourselves looking for parallels between such personal religious experiences and the way that people organize themselves in societies. Remembering that Durkheim suggested religion is a social phenomenon, and also that society is a religious phenomenon, we find ourselves, just like Guy Swanson, looking for ways to link these two aspects of life together. Do they reflect each other in systematic ways? One simple but powerful way to explore systematic parallels between religion and other aspects of society comes from the tried and true comparative method. It bothers a lot of people that there are so many different varieties of religion. Even though each religion enthusiastically presents itself as the ultimate truth about life, the universe, and everything, more than one perceptive believer has had to wrestle with the troubling reality that other people in other places believe in a different version of the ultimate truth. Who's right? Who's wrong? How can you tell? Fortunately, this question does not come up in the sociology of religion. We are not concerned here with finding out which version of the ultimate truth is right or wrong in an absolute sense. We don't have access to reliable evidence that would allow us to resolve this question, so we'll let theologians debate about that. Like Swanson, we ask a different question. What parallels can we find between the content of religions on one hand and the ways that people organize their societies on the other? Do certain kinds of social organization seem to show up where we find certain kinds of religious ideas? Do such ideas tend to appear in one kind of society rather than another? Be very careful to keep in mind that, like Durkheim, we are not saying that one side of the coin is a cause and the other is a result. Heads and tails of a coin are part of one reality. And Swanson sets out to test this same simple idea. He wants to find out whether he could find predictable patterns in religious beliefs, let's call them heads, that matched up with predictable patterns in the organization of different society. Let's call that tails. To launch his exploration, Swanson had to settle first of all on some very basic general categories of religious beliefs. If we want to find patterns that span a truly wide range of different religions and societies all around the world, and even perhaps back through historical time, we can't get too wrapped up in picky details of one specific religion or another. We can't worry too much, for example, about whether different groups of people believe that Jesus was a purely divine, godlike being, or just an ordinary man, or somehow both of these things at the same time. We can't worry that some people believe that the Prophet Muhammad's open window to God has remained open over the centuries to Ayatollahs who trace their lineage directly back to him as their ancestor, while other people believe that this divine window was only open to Muhammad himself and closed again when he was gone. Instead, Swanson surveys as much as he can of what William James called the varieties of religious experience and tries to find the most basic kinds of beliefs that show up under different names in different times and places. The most fundamental such beliefs for Swanson reflects his reading of Durkheim. When we look at organized religion as one of the social institutions found in human societies, Durkheim and many others have identified one feature that sets this institution apart from all others, the concept of a fundamental separation between the everyday, secular or profane world in which we live, where we can only see what is, and a transcendent sacred reality from which we can get a sense of direction about what should be in the world. Through religion, we believe that we can make contact with this sacred realm from which we can draw strength, inner peace, comfort, and security, or more generally, a superior power to guide our lives. This belief in a superior power available to people through their religious contact with the realm of the sacred appears in many times and places and under many names. Swanson follows Durkheim in regarding this belief as a fundamental common denominator of human religions. To emphasize how widespread it seems to be, he gives it an exotic name borrowed from Polynesian cultures in the South Pacific. He calls it manna. This is not the same thing as the flakes of food that the Israelites found on the ground in the Sinai desert. That manna is spelled differently. Still following the lead of Durkheim, Swanson accepts the idea that this belief in manna, or sacred power, is a reflection of the potentialities that we experience when we live together with other people in organized societies. No matter how any society is organized, such a social reality has one universal feature. People connected to other people always can accomplish more than any one individual could do alone. Everyone easily recognizes this latent social power to transcend the limitations of life as a solitary human being. We might call it teamwork. Swanson calls it manna. George Lucas tapped into this universal human perception of the potentialities we enjoy when we live together in societies. What Luke Skywalker and the other Jedi call the Force is a modern popularization of the same religious impulse that Swanson calls manna. This explains why even those around him refer to Darth Vader's dark side path to the Force as a religion, not as some kind of secular scientific tool or technique. So for Swanson, this idea of manna, or the Force, provides a kind of pool of raw material from which people can fashion a religion. It is available to all human groups who come together and organize themselves into a society. Or maybe we should say that once people get the idea of such collective potential, they are able to organize themselves into a society. Remember, we're not going to settle the chicken and egg question of which comes first, the material reality or the abstract idea of social life. Once we have the potential reservoir of manna to work with, Swanson leads us into his actual research questions. Do different forms of social organization tend to go along with different ways of thinking about how to tap into the Force, different patterns of religious beliefs? The other fundamental feature of such beliefs that he considers might be thought of as taking the vague potentialities of manna all around us and crystallizing them into specific, concrete focal points. Various religions might call these gods, or demons, or angels, or ghosts. Swanson calls all of them simply spirits. Darth Vader totally destroyed the actual Obi-Wan, leaving nothing but his robe on the floor. Not long afterward, however, Obi-Wan's disembodied voice starts murmuring advice in Luke's ear. Obi-Wan represents one crystallized focal point in the Force, what Swanson would call a spirit. It's easy to suspect that somebody whispered in the same way to George Lucas about Swanson and the birth of the gods at some point. And this brings us to Swanson's clincher, the key point on which he built his book. He suggests that different specific patterns of religious beliefs, such as believing in different kinds of spirits, is a reflection of different patterns of institutionalized social life. Maybe the religious beliefs make the social institutions possible. Maybe the social organization gives people the idea for the religious beliefs. As we investigate Swanson's research, we don't really care which is which. We just want to see whether he can actually come up with such patterns. Where would you look to test such an idea? By the middle of the 20th century, fortunately for Swanson, the anthropologists had been busy. They had gone nosing around in all kinds of corners of the globe, living with exotic groups of people and writing down all kinds of details about their ways of life. In fact, this drive for intensive study of exotic social groups actually took place in part because the anthropologists were unhappy about the smug sociological tendencies of that time. Sociologists, who tended to be interested almost exclusively in what their current neighbors were doing within the confines of their own society, sometimes let their enthusiasm get the better of them and started pretending that patterns they observed, like gender roles for men and women, or differences between people in small towns and big cities, represented timeless universal truths about the human condition. They generalized from what they could see out their windows to universal laws of society. The anthropologists weren't so sure. They insisted that you can't just note a few isolated facts about a social setting. You need to sit yourself down among people, live with them, and learn to understand their entire society as an integrated and complex whole. As part of this impulse to study and catalog diverse societies around the globe, people like George Peter Murdock and his colleagues began to collect and compile the results of such explorations. By the time that Swanson was ready to start looking for parallels between religious beliefs and forms of social organization, Murdock and his colleague had published something called the Ethnographic Atlas, a massive collection of information from all around the world, and even in some cases gleaned from historical records. Out of more than 1,000 different case studies, Swanson selected 50 different societies to study. In his choices, he carefully considered Murdock's warnings, such as the problem that you should not consider 5 or 6 small-scale societies that are all close neighbors of each other as truly independent cases. To get societies that probably had little or no influence on each other, Swanson picked some of the classic anthropologist subjects like the Arapesh and the Dobu, but also included the ancient Aztecs, the Iroquois encountered by the first European settlers, the Romans from the pre-Empire period, the Zulus from Africa, and the Zuni from the American Southwest. Then he hired some students to comb through the Ethnographic Atlas and extract out specific kinds of information from each of these 50 groups. The students had only the archival materials to study, no field observations of their own or first-person survey responses, but Swanson had several people examine each society independently and then check to make sure that they were all finding essentially the same characteristics when they looked at a particular group. For each of these 50 societies, the coders consulted the list of 39 different social features that Swanson wanted to compare and classified each society on each measure. The 39 different features that the students examined can be grouped into 2 categories corresponding to the 2 sides of the sociological coin Swanson wanted to examine. The first 24 or so of these measures had to do with details of social organization. These include the population size of the society, the organization of the family as an institution, and so on. For example, item 3 measured whether the society was at risk of attack by outside groups. Item 5 considered whether people were settled in scattered, isolated dwellings, small villages, or larger towns and cities. Item 12 is undoubtedly the most complicated measure, both in terms of all the things that the student coders had to consider and all the theoretical ramifications that Swanson applies to its use in his explanations later on. We'll come back to this complex idea and measure it in a moment. The final items in Swanson's list, on the other hand, cover a considerable list of different options for religious beliefs. The first one of these, item 25, concerns monotheism, belief that there is one supreme, all-powerful, godlike spirit, and that any and all other spiritual forces are subordinate to and controlled by, or even created by, the supreme being. Item 29 measures whether people in each society believe that the spirits of their ancestors continue observing and perhaps helping them even after death. This is where we would check off the box for Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. These ancestors sometimes might just watch us, judging our actions, or they might interfere for good or ill in our lives. The next item, item 30, about a belief in reincarnation, often gets mixed up with the idea of ancestral spirits, but is quite different. Ancestral spirits continue the existence and the specific identity of the person who has died. For reincarnation, the spirit leaves the person who had died, and that specific identity is lost. The spirit moves instead into a new person with a new identity. The Dalai Lama, one of the top 2 leaders of Tibetan Buddhists, provides an excellent example of reincarnation beliefs. Item 36, close to the end of Swanson's list, codes for a belief in the power of black magic or witchcraft. Swanson's ideas about this topic are some of the most interesting in his book. This kind of magic exists when people believe in a sort of democracy when it comes to the access to the realm of the sacred. When witches use black magic, they have direct access to the sacred power of mana. Working alone as a solitary individual, such a magician can control and command the power of mana to accomplish personal goals. They are not obeying divine commandments or following the instructions of spirits. Instead, they are giving the commands and using the power of the sacred however they wish. Before we turn to the details of how Swanson expected these measures of social organization to match up to different kinds of religious beliefs, it might be helpful to pay a little more attention to that most complicated idea in his book, the idea of a sovereign group. We might recognize the concept of sovereignty from political science. This refers to absolute or ultimate authority over some kind of decision to be made in any society. My favorite example of the sovereignty concept comes from a story told to me by a Russian friend and colleague many years ago. He liked to talk about changes in the Russian family. The patriarch of a family, he would explain, used to say to his sons, "I gave you life, and I can take it away." Fathers actually had the right of capital punishment for members of their family. If a father killed his son for doing something bad, the Tsar would congratulate him on keeping good order in the family. But today, my friend would continue, the Russian son says to the father, "You gave me life, now give me everything else." The first version, with the all-powerful father, shows us a case of the family as a sovereign group. The second version, with the entitled son, does not. Sovereign groups thus have absolute control over some specific aspect of social life. The more you think about this idea, the more clearly we can see how complex this topic can become. There are many different possible decisions that have to be made in societies about how you choose a marriage partner, about who owns property like houses or tools or clothing, about whether owners can sell things without asking anybody else, about how people get the food they eat, about who can use coercive force to compel other people to do things, and so on. Not only does Swanson consider different possible institutions, like a family or a tribe or a guild of craftsmen, as possible sovereign groups, but he asked the students to code how many such different groups, each responsible for sovereignty over some aspect of social life, they could find in each considered society. While we could go on exploring the details of this sovereign group concept a lot longer, this may give us enough understanding to see how Swanson uses the idea in guessing what he might find and then testing those expectations against the Ethnographic Atlas data coded by his students. The power of Swanson's argument rests in part on the very clean and simple connections that he hypothesizes between social organization and religious beliefs. But these clever hypotheses wouldn't amount to much unless the actual results of analysis based on Ethnographic Atlas data show some proof that such connections do in fact exist. On both counts, Swanson's little book, published more than half a century ago, still stands as a classic in the sociology of religion. Let's start with his most complicated idea about sovereign groups. What might such an abstract, complicated idea have to do with religious beliefs? This actually turns out to be one of the strongest, most classic observations from his book. Swanson tells us, We shall expect to find evidence of monotheism where, counting out from the individual to the boundary of his society, there are 3 or more types of sovereign groups ranked in hierarchical order. One example of this might be parents in a family who have sovereign authority over their children, telling them when to go to bed and whether they can go out and play. That's the first sovereign level. But above them, we might find a local town or village council that sets a curfew, restricting children from being out in the town after dark. And if a parent objected to this curfew ordered by the village, we could find a 3rd level of sovereign organization in a national court that hears the case and probably upholds the town council over the parent. Why should such a hierarchy of sovereign groups be linked to monotheism? Swanson's answer is that the all-powerful high God creates order and harmony among any and all other spirits, but exists at a level remote from individual believers, directly parallel to the way that a 3rd or higher level sovereign group sorts out disputes and enforces order all the way down to the level of individuals in the everyday material world. The two are reflections of each other. In this sense, it doesn't matter whether belief in a high God makes complex society possible, or a complex society suggests the idea of a high God. These alternatives are heads and tails of the same social coin again. So what does Swanson find? Out of the societies where sovereign groups were clearly identified, in 19 cases there were only 1 or 2 such levels of such groups, and only 2 of those 19 cases reported a belief in a supreme deity. In contrast, out of the 20 societies where students coded 3 or more levels of hierarchy for sovereign groups, 17 of them also had a belief in a high or supreme God. The evidence is pretty overwhelming. Complex hierarchical societies believe in high gods. Simpler, less hierarchical societies do not. We definitely have to score 1 for Swanson in this case. Okay, feeling pretty good about this test, Swanson moves on to his next guess. We shall expect to find active ancestral spirits in societies which have kinship organizations more embracive than the nuclear family, organizations that continue to embody the purposes which, as former members of these groups, the ancestors shared. This time, perhaps quite logically, Swanson looks for a social institution that has some direct relevance for ancestral spirits. Of course, this has to be the kinship lineage that defines what an ancestor is in the first place. In some societies, kinship lineages still exert a powerful influence over people's lives. Your relatives can make you or break you, and you depend on their support for many aspects of your life. In other societies, such kin ties are mostly sentimental attachments, and your relatives have little actual influence, for good or ill, over how your life turns out. Swanson thinks that this should be linked to whether you believe in ancestral spirits. This time he has several levels of such beliefs. At the lowest level, people don't believe in ancestral spirits at all. This involved 18 out of the 50 societies, which are left out of Swanson's table in the book. Some societies think that ancestral spirits are out there, watching over them and providing an extra motive to do the right thing or refrain from doing bad things. We don't want to look bad in front of the ancestors. At the next level, the ancestral spirits are no longer content to just sit back and watch. When you do something bad, they come along and punish you. When you do the right thing, they make sure with their supernatural powers that you are rewarded for it. But the final, highest level turns out to be the most empirically important category in Swanson's data. At this level, not only are the ancestral spirits out there and active in the world, but you actually can interact with them, call on them for help. Almost 80% of societies that believe in such responsive ancestral spirits have large, extended, and powerful kinship lineages that preserve and sustain the influence of these same ancestors. After the ancestral spirits, Swanson shifts his attention to the closely related idea of reincarnation. Now, what kind of social pattern might be reflected in a widespread belief in reincarnation? Swanson has another guess. Let us suppose that a small cluster of related nuclear families or a tiny community of unrelated individuals lived in relative isolation from its neighbors. The particular potentialities of each member are appreciated, and those effects persist after a member dies. This is an interesting idea. When you live in the midst of lots of people, where people are dying and being born all the time, and where community life reflects the contributions of many people, including strangers as well as close friends and relatives, the death of a beloved family member doesn't change your world as dramatically. In contrast, as Swanson's data make clear, most of the societies where people do believe in reincarnation are small, relatively isolated communities where you would expect the memory of such relatives to live on after them. A nose or an ear or a smile might remind everyone of somebody they used to know. So in this case, the scale of social life, its size and social density, turns out to be strongly linked to the existence of this particular kind of religious belief. Finally, we will consider one of Swanson's findings that many people still find most relevant to contemporary American society. It would be very interesting to hear how Swanson might explain our current fascination with zombies and the undead, but unfortunately he didn't have that on his radar, so we'll never know. It's not all that clear that the current zombie craze is actually religious in nature anyway. Today's zombies are usually some kind of medical or scientific problem, not a moral and religious phenomenon. But we also spend a lot of time and attention on witchcraft and black magic, and Swanson does have data for that. What kind of society should resonate strongly with such beliefs? Swanson suggests that the widespread use of black magic suggests a serious lack of legitimate means of social control and moral bonds. It implies that people need to control one another in situations where such control is not provided by means which have public approval. What exactly does he mean by this? What kind of social settings expose people to conflicts without providing safe, agreed-on channels for resolving such conflict? Swanson considers two ways that such dangerous situations might arise. First, if your nice organized society is threatened by outside enemies who might invade your territory, steal your property or perhaps your children, and beat you up or even possibly kill you, that certainly would qualify as unregulated conflict. What's the old saying? There are no rules in love and war. Swanson's first example covers the war part of this saying. His second example might cover the love part of this saying. Unresolved conflicts can arise from within a society itself, not just from outside threats. If social controls over behavior are absent or weak, a society can experience what Hobbes called the war of all against all, in which every man's hand is raised against his neighbor. When anybody can do anything to anybody else and get away with it, everyone becomes defensive and suspicious. Swanson thinks that this is exactly when people will feel the need of something like black magic and witchcraft, or perhaps fear that others are using these tools against them. And sure enough, in the societies where students didn't code any situations of uncontrolled relationships, the belief in witchcraft and black magic almost never shows up. On the other hand, in societies where internal conflicts have no legitimate solutions, and also in societies vulnerable to the threat of conflicts with outside groups, people believe in the existence of witchcraft and black magic in a large majority of all cases. So Swanson's little book, published over 2 generations ago, still presents us today with a systematic picture of many ways that the content of people's religious beliefs reflect variations in the form of social organization in which they live. You may think of additional examples of such parallels, and that's the sociology of religion.